Hello, everyone. Welcome to our online video series, Reading Hope in Trying Times. Our guest today is Parker Palmer. Parker is founder and senior partner emeritus of the Center of Courage and Renewal. He's a world-renowned writer, speaker, and activist who focuses on issues in education, community, leadership, spirituality, and social change. His new project is The Growing Edge with singer-songwriter Carrie Newcomer. Parker holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley, as well as 13 honorary doctorates. He is the author of 10 books, including several award-winning titles that have sold over 1.5 million copies and been translated into 10 languages. In 1998, the Leadership Project, a national survey of 10,000 educators, named Parker one of the 30 most influential senior leaders in higher education and one of the 10 key agenda setters of the past decade. Since 2002, the Accrediting Commission for Graduate Medical Education has given annual Parker J. Palmer Courage to Teach and Courage to Lead awards to directors of exemplary medical residency programs. In 2010, Parker was given the William Rainey Harper Award, whose previous recipients include Margaret Mead, Elie Wiesel, Marshall McLuhan, and Paola Freire. In 2011, the Utne Reader named him one of 25 visionaries on its annual list of people who are changing the world. And in 2017, he received the Shalom Institute's Contemplative Voices Award. So we're so very glad to have you here with us today, Parker. We greatly appreciate you joining us.
Oh, thank you, Brian. It's great to be on with you.
Well, maybe we could start by just having you share some of your thoughts on this whole pandemic and what impact it's had for you and what reflections you've made on all of this.
Well, it's pretty predictable that we're all thinking about that these days, one way or another. So I'm glad to share some reflections of my own for whatever they're worth. My wife and I here in Madison, Wisconsin, have been sheltering at home since the 1st of March, which was before our state started sheltering. And one of the first things that I got to thinking about was the word apocalypse, because I heard people using that, people who saw what was coming, using that word to describe the pandemic. And I think I dimly remembered from the year I spent at Union Theological Seminary that apocalypse has a Greek root, which means to uncover, to reveal. It doesn't mean what it's normally, the way it's normally used, total and absolute disaster. It's a revelation. It's an uncovering of truths that have been hidden in plain sight, but hidden they have been. And so I got to thinking in the midst of an initial wave of fear or frustration, got to thinking about the whole question of what I might learn from this experience. Learning has always been, for me, a way through critical situations, including my 3 descents in my adult life into profound clinical depression. You don't learn while you're in the middle of it, but as you begin to emerge, you do learn a lot. And by learning, I mean about myself, about the larger world, and about the relation between me and it, me and them. And what kind of dance has that been? Has that been a life-giving dance or a death-dealing dance? So I think it's a very important form of learning. So to be concrete about my learning, I think I went through maybe a day or so of fear around the fact that I am in what the experts call a high-risk category in the midst of this pandemic. And that's because of age. I'm 81, and underlying health conditions, of which I have a few. And I'm therefore more vulnerable to the coronavirus than certain other demographics are, although we all know that there are demographics that are incredibly vulnerable, even though they may not be anywhere near my age. Demographics formed largely by structural inequality, poverty in our country and around the world. So that notion that I was in a high risk category made me feel for a little while sorry for myself, I guess. But I quickly began on this learning journey thinking about all the people around the world who live their whole lives in a high risk category because of pandemics of other sorts, pandemics of racism, pandemics of misogyny, pandemics of genocide, pandemics of structural economic inequality, pandemics of nationalism and white supremacy. It doesn't take long to realize that there are people who are born into a pandemic of that sort and will die in a pandemic of that sort, perhaps of old age, but too often from other unnatural causes. And in an interesting way, Brian, that realization, that apocalyptic learning, if you will, gave me a deeper sense of identity with millions of people around the planet with whom I had some sense of identity because I've been fortunate to have mentors and to have experiences and to be on a journey of realizing that we really are all in this together, not just as a philosophical abstraction, but as a concrete fact, that it's really true that what hurts one of us ultimately hurts all of us. I think that was one of the big lessons that Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to teach people who look like me, quite reasonably well-off, educated people who too easily can assume privilege and all of the bad stuff is happening to somebody else and I don't care about it. But, you know, King was famous for saying that ultimately oppression hurts the oppressor worse even than it does the oppressed, or at least as badly. And I deeply believe that to be true. But this realization that I'm now part of a global high-risk community really deepened that sense of connection. And for me, anything that makes us realize that we are connected to people that we will never meet and people whose fates we might otherwise ignore, that's a good thing. That's a life-giving thing. In this case, it may not sound reassuring to some people, you know, to deal with my own state of high risk by identifying with other people's state of high risk to some extent. But it gives me at least a tiny window into the way lots of other people live their whole lives and increases my sense of, you know, that these are my brothers and sisters. I think there are kind of two fundamental yearnings in human life. One is to feel at home in our own skins, and the other is to feel at home on the face of this very diverse planet. And this made me feel at home because I identified those yearnings in myself a long time ago. I think there's a lot more I could say about this, but let me just end with one more thing. For me, this insight was really more of a gut feeling before it was an insight. It led me to stop even entertaining the question, why me? Which is a question that a lot of us ask under these circumstances. Instead, I started asking a question that a lot of people with terminal diseases have learned to ask as a source of relief. Why not me? Why not me? I'm part of the human race. These things happen to the human race. As Thomas Merton reminded us, it's a good thing to be part of the human race. And people who know Merton will remember his famous experience on the corner of 4th and Walnut in Louisville, where he had this revelation and ended up writing, thank God, I am like other men and women. I am not the special, secluded monastic self I've been thinking of myself as. I'm part of the human race, and that's a glorious thing, because we're all made in the image of God, and to be in that together and knowing that we're together, consciously claiming that we're together in that, is life-giving, healthy, and whole. So for me, that, alongside all of the concerns about people I love, especially about people I love who unfortunately follow the wrong leaders and believe what those leaders say, and therefore took risks which now have them sick with the coronavirus and, in a few cases, dead from it. Along with all of that, and some economic concerns and some concerns about the future of my grandchildren, this for me has involved all of those burdens, but also this revelatory moment, which has me more at home on the face of the earth.
Well, Parker, it strikes me you've got a really strong sense of empathy, and kind of on a global basis, I would say. I think you probably had the benefit, as I have had, of a lot of international travel throughout your life.
Not a lot, really, Brian. Most of my travel, I traveled a lot, half my time for maybe 40 years as a writer, traveling teacher, lecturer, workshop leader. But I was traveling so much in this country where a lot of the work was initially, that I didn't travel much overseas. I've always found travel exhausting. So I have taught in places like England and Finland and a few other spots, but I'm not as nearly as well traveled, let's say, as most members of the rising generation are. I have a granddaughter who right now is in Paris dealing with the coronavirus big time, but also finishing up a degree in library and information science, and with a job waiting for her there at the Paris Library, if and when things clear up enough for her to take the job. So I think more, Brian, for me, it's the blessing of a good education, and what I learned along the way about the function of imagination, especially as fed by good literature, good philosophical texts, good theology, and good conversations. I think one of my yearnings in life, I realized my graduate work was in sociology, so it's no news to me that everybody has a social location, and what we can know depends, hinges heavily on what our social location is. My social location is pretty obvious to anybody watching this video. I'm white, male, reasonably well off. I'm straight. I'm Christian. In other words, I'm the kind of person that this society was made to work best for. Sadly, tragically, the racist DNA of this society, which keeps manifesting itself all these years later, has not been a barrier for me, because the society was crafted by people who look like me and was made for people like me. So I understood early on that my best chance of coming to feel at home on the face of a diverse earth and benefiting from that diversity would come from an imaginative identification through good literature and good conversation with people who occupy other social locations. So I've actively in my life reached out for all of that. And I think in my case, that's where it comes from. I've always been eager, certainly since my mid-20s, been eager to bust out as best I can of my demographic in terms of how I look at the world. as everybody knows, there are lots of people who do that, try to do that. And as everyone knows, that's hard work, because you see what you see. And when somebody else says, well, I see something different, and in what I see, people like you are not, you're weeds in the garden. You're not the flowers you think you are. That's hard learning. But I think one must try to do it to feel at home on the face of the earth in an honest way.
It really seems like you've learned quite well from those types of experiences, I'll have to say.
I think I'm a work in progress, like most of us.
So you mentioned about your spells with serious depression. What kinds of things did you learn then that you can draw upon today in what we're going through?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and it's one I'm very glad to talk about. I've tried, ever since I was able to wrap my mind around my first deep dive into depression, my mind, my heart, my soul, and actually acknowledge that it happened, and that I was ready to talk about it because it was well enough integrated into my sense of self that I could do so without shame or embarrassment. I've really felt called to write and talk about it because so many people suffer in a really needless way from what this society regards as the shame of depression. And folks associated with them suffer as well. And as I said, I think when I introduced that subject earlier in our conversation, you don't learn from it while you're in it. While you're in it, it's just like moment by moment survival. And my depressions, 2 in my 40s and 1 in my 60s, involved many days of wondering if this was the day to get it all over with. And as I like to put it, when you get to that place with depression, it's not that you're lost in the dark. Being lost in the dark, there's still a difference between the darkness and you. And you can negotiate your situation a bit. You can grope around in that darkness, try to find a door handle, a window, a shade to pull up, something, to let in some light, because you're not the same as the darkness. But when you're in deep depression, it's as if you had become the dark. You had become the dark. You're not lost in the dark. You are the dark. And there's no way to negotiate that, because there's no separation between you and the darkness. You can't feel around in it. It's just who and what you are. There's an annihilation of self that goes on at those depths. So you just sweat it out if you're lucky, if you get some help. In my case, each of these lasted 6 to 8 months. I was on medications for probably 6 months to a year, depending on which of the 3 we're talking about. Was ultimately able to get off medications. Of course, there are people who have to stay on them, and that's what they should do if that's what brings them, puts a floor under them emotionally and brings them life. So the learnings come as one begins to emerge, I think, and I'll mention just 2. I wrote about this in a little book called Let Your Life Speak, in a chapter called All the Way Down. And I think I touch on it again in my most recent book, which came out in 2018, called On the Brink of Everything, Grace, Gravity, and Getting Old. So 2 learnings. One is that, and both of them incidentally came via therapists that I talked with who were very helpful. And I highly recommend not only medication if you need it, but talk therapy when you're able to do it. I found to be a very good thing once I found the right therapist. So 2 different learnings. One is a very simple one, which I use to this day. A therapist urged me at one time when I felt that I was making zero progress. He said, start keeping a daily journal of small achievements. And I said, come on, man, I can't write a coherent sentence, because I was thinking of journaling, as a literary exercise. He said, no, that's not what I mean. I don't mean, a journal that might be publishable. I mean, you get a little notebook, and at the top of the page, you put the date, and the next entry might be the time you got up. And by the time on that day, got up at 11 a.m., because one of the things you do in depression is you hide out in bed as long as you can in a darkened room. At least I did. And the next day you make that same entry, the time you got up, and you find, oh, I got up this morning at 10:45. Count that as a small achievement. And then he said, continue that way when there's something to make note of. For example, the only way I could get outdoors, which I needed exercise, I needed to get out of that darkened room. He said the only way I could get out was to ride my bike, because the world was full of knives. And if I went walking, I might run across someone who wanted to talk with me. And I couldn't tolerate it. It was just too dangerous. And so by riding my bike, I could just whiz on by. And that's what I did. So he said, on one day you might say I rode my bike for 10 minutes. And incidentally, I was in such bad shape that when I went out to ride my bike, I took the garage door opener with me. And when I got within a block of our house, I clicked that garage door opener so I could ride right into the garage, close the door behind me without risking a conversation with a neighbor. Ordinarily, as you can tell, I like to talk, but not in those days. So he said, Parker, he didn't say this immediately. He pointed this out to me later. He said, Parker, what you're going to see is that there is a sawtooth pattern to progression. One day you're a little up, next day you're a little down. But if you keep a journal like this, you will see that the angle of that saw blade goes in a generally upward direction. And that was true. So eventually I'm getting up at 8:30 instead of 11 o'clock, even though some days were down and some days were up. The other thing I learned that he kind of clued me into was, he said, you've lived a life, Parker, where you're always looking for the next big success, right? And you're addicted to the next big success. You don't want to journal, you don't want to journal about getting up 15 minutes earlier than you did yesterday. You want to journal about getting a book published or getting good reviews or something of that sort. So he said, you need to recalibrate your notion of what success is. And I really got that, and I use that to this day. And it's interesting, in aging, you can't leap over tall buildings at a single bound, right? The way you thought you could when you were 30 or 40 or 50, not at 81, you can't, I can't anyway. And so you have to learn to start measuring yourself or holding yourself accountable for small successes that can make a difference to your well-being, like getting out for a walk and making it longer every day, even when you feel tired or shaky in the legs. So that was a big learning for me that I really value to this very day, even though I'm in full health psychologically. And the second learning, about which I could go on at length, I won't. At one point, this therapist, after listening to my litany of woes and miseries, which were very real for me at the time, he, on the fourth or fifth session, said something that I'll never forget. He said, Parker, it seems to me that you image your depression as the hand of an enemy trying to to crush you. The hand of an enemy trying to crush you. would it be possible to image it as the hand of a friend trying to press you down to ground on which it's safe to stand? To ground on which it's safe to stand. That image, it wasn't like a silver bullet or a magic wand. It didn't work right away, but I knew it was worth attending to, and so I attended to it. And what I learned over time about myself is that I had been living at altitude. And there are several kinds of altitude at which some of us, certainly me, have tried to live. There's the altitude of ego. I can do anything I want to do. There's the altitude of intellect. I have ideas about all of this, so they should solve everything. There's the altitude of an ethic, which really isn't my ethic to live. It's something I inherited, a set of oughts that really don't have anything to do with who I am. They're all about who I ought to be. That doesn't work. And then there's altitude involved in a lot of forms of spirituality, which at least back in the day were heavily about up, up and away, rather than about down to the ground of our being. So ego, intellect, ethics, spirituality, if you live at altitude in those regards, or any significant number of those four, when you trip and fall, as we do with great regularity, you have a long way to fall. And you might kill yourself. But if you're on the ground with your life in those regards, you can fall a dozen times a day, which sometimes we do. Get up, brush yourself off, and take the next step. It may hurt, but you're not going to die. So I learned, those were some learnings from depression as I began to come out of it and began to understand more about who I was and what the world was about in terms of its expectations of me, or what I projected as its expectations of me. And I also learned that there are critical regards in which I can control those expectations by simply not buying into some of them. To saying to the world or to relevant people in the world, well, those are lovely ideas, but they're not about me. So I don't feel accountable to any of them. I've come through hard experience to know myself, and I recognize my calling when I see it, and I recognize what's your agenda, not mine. And so thanks, but no thanks.
Wow, what a rich set of perspectives that you've gathered. Very, very deep and very meaningful. As someone who's never experienced that type of depression, it's just hard for me even mentally to understand it. I can understand poverty, when I see poverty, or I can understand, race inequity, even though I can't walk in their shoes. I understand that, but at least intellectually, I can understand it. And I can't understand, some of the kinds of, psychological, depression kinds of things that you're describing. I mean, I don't mean to dismiss that in any way, shape, or form. It's just that I just don't have the capacity.
Yeah, I actually appreciate you saying that, Brian, because the worst thing that a person who's depressed and in that has become the darkness, or is even lost in the dark, the way I described, the worst thing you can say to such a person is, I understand exactly what you're going through. You don't. You just don't.
I can believe that.
Yeah. So it's
no way.
Really, yeah, it's really an act of accompaniment by honesty to say, I have no way of understanding this. And it's a very honest statement, because while a lot of people have experienced it, not everyone has had an experience of self-annihilation. And that's what it is. It's death in life. I, as a writer, I try to choose my words and sentences with some care, And so that's not hyperbole for me. It's the closest I will ever come to death in life, which is not to say I now know a lot about actual physical death. I don't. Nobody does. But I understand what this form of death in life means. And I'll tell you a learning out of that, since you've really helpfully raised the subject by saying that you don't understand it. For me, I was raised in a tradition that believes in resurrection, right? Life after death. I got to a point in my life in my mid-30s where before the Depression hit, where I was really wondering about that and even rejecting that resurrection belief. But I now have what the Quakers, I'm a Quaker, would call an experimentally or experientially grounded belief in resurrection, because I found new life after an experience of death in life. I know this is possible. I'm not privy to reports from the other side, the way people sometimes talk about death. Whatever those memos are, I haven't gotten one. And yet I do have a life experience of resurrection, of not only surviving, but thriving in the wake of it, for which I'm obviously enormously grateful. But it has also, it's still in the realm of mystery to me. I'll tell you one thing I wrote in Let Your Life Speak, in that chapter about depression. I hear people saying, I don't understand why so-and-so who was depressed killed himself, committed suicide, took his life. Well, I do. Just ask me. They were absolutely exhausted and they needed the rest. That's not a flippant response. That's exactly how it feels. What tempts you to take your life is the absolute ground into dust self-annihilation of depression that wears you out to where there's nothing left. What I don't understand, if you want a mystery, is why some people survive and thrive on the other side. And any good psychiatrist will say, there's a lot we don't know about depression. Sometimes medication helps, sometimes talk therapy helps, sometimes exercise helps, sometimes diet helps, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes it's genetic, sometimes it's all brain chemistry, sometimes it's all situational, sometimes it's interactions of those two that are so complex, we may never figure them out. So, we shouldn't accept facile answers to the question of how some people not only survive, but thrive. For me, the outcome of all of that is simply profound gratitude and, of course, profound grief for the people who got to the point where they just needed the rest, alongside the fact that I'm glad they found peace.
Wow. So one of the things that you mentioned is calibrations. And that strikes me as something that pretty applicable for us all right now. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Thank you. That's a great pickup. I hadn't quite thought of it that way, but yeah, absolutely. So we're in a situation now, whether we're old or young, where we cannot go out each day and slay dragons, right? We're lucky if we can slay the ones in our own heads and hearts. So I do think that dialing our self-expectations down is important, and to try to do so without a sense that we are failures. I think a big learning in this, a lot of people have talked about this, is being reminded that we are not in control of really anything fundamental, including our own lives or our careers, our fates, our income, etc. And it doesn't solve the problem, but it's a step in the right direction to acknowledge that in our normal, quote, normal state of functioning, we think we can control a lot, and we beat ourselves up when something happens that we have the illusion that we might have controlled. But as everybody knows who's had things fall apart, part of the art of living and living in grace is to acknowledge your powerlessness about a whole lot of things and to work on the one thing you can control, which is your own response to that, to your own powerlessness and to whatever external situation may disempowered you, to control your own response to all of that. And, you know, even though today is, the situation today is really, really excruciatingly painful and tragic for many people who don't, and here again, let's introduce the notion of social location. They don't have the luxury that I have of having spent 40 years working independently from a home office to make my living. They have jobs, as most people do, where they have to go out to a shop, to a store, to a restaurant, to an office building. They have to ride a subway. They have to, whatever. They have to be with other people to some extent to make their living. And as long as they and others can't be there, the very place in which they work may well be slowly disappearing. One of the things that my wife and I are trying to do right now is we live in a place in Madison, Wisconsin, where there are some really good, not expensive, but good restaurants that are struggling to stay afloat through a carry-out business, takeout business. And we're trying to support them as best we can when we feel we can afford a takeout meal. Let's get one, and let's leave, you know, a 50% tip rather than a 25% tip for people who are just trying to hang on to their jobs, if we can. So there are a lot of people who don't have that luxury the way I do, and I can barely put myself in their shoes. I'm also 81, and so I have Social Security coming in, and I have some books out there that bring me an income, which is how I've made my living. If this had hit me 25 years ago, when most of my income was coming through speaking and workshop leading, it would be a very different picture when my books weren't as well known as they are now, or maybe I hadn't written books that might be as good as more recent books. I don't know. It's hard to judge in one's own work, but you know, I have a tiny window into what they're experiencing, and I feel deeply for them, and it can sound very hollow to them when somebody like me says, try to control your own reactions, your own responses to this as best you can, so that while you acknowledge there are things you can't control, you still retain a sense of empowerment for your own life, that you still have agency, even though there's a lot you can't control. And the reason I think that's important is this, and I don't think this is, you know, cheerleading for the impossible. If we relinquish control over those things we can control, then our responses to the situation become more and more dysfunctional. Put it this way, the more fearful we are of not being able to control anything, the more that fear will paralyze us, to the point that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We won't be able to control anything because fear is blocking our way. And I think, this makes me think of a line from scripture that I was raised with in my sort of main line at the time, Methodist tradition, center, left of center Methodism back in the day, where I often heard from the pulpit the line, "Be not afraid," which I later learned the equivalent of which was found in other traditions. And I puzzled over that because as a young person and on into my adult years, fear was a big piece of my life. I was battling it constantly, and I thought I was failing as a human being because, I wasn't following "Be not afraid." And then I started reflecting on that more deeply and realized that the counsel is not, you can't have fear, which we all do. The counsel is, you don't need to be your fear. And that's different. The way I put it to myself is this: we all have an inner landscape in which fear is one part of the ecosystem, but that ecosystem has other parts. It has ground called faith, it has a ground called hope, it has a ground called fellow feeling and community. And we have choices to make about where we stand in that inner landscape as we move toward other people and the world. As I speak to you now, as I take action in the various ways I've taken action in my life, through, for example, the work of the Center for Courage and Renewal, I can choose, I can have fear as part of who I am, but I don't have to be fear as I move toward you and others and the world, the larger world itself. And that's been very liberating for me. So yes, of course, we all have fears right now, but I think we have to reflect very carefully on what ground we can stand on to not be our fear. And let me just refer briefly to the people who I see acting this out much more fully than anyone in my situation is. And those are the frontline healthcare workers that we're all aware of now, that have entered our pantheon of heroes, because every day they get up afraid that today might be the day they contract coronavirus disease, while serving others and trying to save lives or make the process of dying as comfortable as possible. And yet they go to work because they stand on some ground other than their fear. They stand in their Hippocratic oath, or they stand in their commitment to service. And this is what all great human beings have done, over the course of history in times of crisis. Of course they have fear, but they find someplace else to stand in their inner landscape so that they don't have to be their fear. So I learned so much from watching them. I can't think of any other way to frame what it is they do every day, on behalf of the rest of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this has been very helpful, Parker. I really appreciate this conversation. Before we wrap up, are there any particular resources that you'd like to tell people about that they should consider?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a big reader. I think, as you know, Brian, I'm a big reader of poetry, and I read poetry every day. I start my day with poetry, and it's laced through the day. Poets like Mary Oliver and William Stafford and Rainer Maria Rilke and Gerard, Manley, Hopkins. A whole range from classic to more contemporary. Poets who write about nature, poets who write about the human condition, poets who write about politics. And I find that fortunately we're not yet at the point where poetry is classified under self-help literature. But I have to say that for myself, I find poetry of more self-help than I find a lot of self-help literature. And I think the reason for that is that we're in the face of massively unknown things, and a massively unknown future. In fact, the future is always unknowable, but we live with a comforting illusion that we can know it. We're now learning we can't, and the poets have a way of walking around the unknowable, the mystery of life, with language that opens things up rather than shutting the mystery down with 12 steps to more success or a better life, which to me kind of shuts a lot of things down. Maybe I can do it in 3 steps, or maybe it's going to take me 82. And I don't think that anybody else knows what those steps are. I think you find them by taking steps and finding yourself sometimes in quicksand and sometimes on solid ground. Poets have that capacity to walk around mysteries like that and help us look at them from different angles. So I recommend that there's a lot of poetry online. You don't have to pay for it. Just try not to end up in the Hallmark section of poetry, and look at some really good poets and see what rolls your socks, as it were, or what brings you up short and say, whoa, that's amazing. How did that person get inside my head and heart so well? I think in a lot of ways, Emily Dickinson said a line years ago that I really adore. She said, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." Because if you try to tell it head on, it's just too bright. It blinds people. And so the poets have this great way of telling the truth slant in a way that it allows us to look at it literally the way, well, not literally, but akin to the way people will tell us that there are stars in the sky that you can't see by looking headlong at them, but you can catch them out of the corner of your eye because of the refractive qualities of that part of the eye. I've always been fascinated by that, and I think this is akin to what poets do when they tell the truth but tell it slant. So, I also love good music, and I have this wonderful colleague whom you have interviewed, Carrie Newcomer. And as you know, Carrie and I have a project together called The Growing Edge, which people can just Google that title, The Growing Edge, along with one of our names, Palmer or Newcomer, and find their way there. The actual website URL is newcomerpalmer.com, and Newcomer is NEWCOMER, Palmer, PALMER.com, and you can see that we're offering a variety of resources there, including Carrie's wonderful music, which so many people are finding, I think, prescient, really, because some of her songs take on a whole new meaning in the times that we're in. And she wrote a song several years back. This is, I think, her 18th album. So she's been at this a while, and she's enormously gifted at both songwriting and performing, and a gifted guitarist as well. She wrote a song a couple years ago called Learning to Live with Not Knowing. Learning to live with not knowing. What more perfect theme for today than that one? and it's readily available online. So music, poetry, other forms of art, I think those are my main go-to resources. And then, of course, as everybody is saying, if you're able, use the technology to reach out to other people you trust, and have a conversation where you get a chance to say what's really on your heart and mind, and listen carefully to what's on the other person's heart and mind. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, quite wonderful advice, and quite wonderful conversation we've been able to have. So,
Thank you,
Parker, I really appreciate you spending some time and sharing, what is obviously a great deal of wisdom with us. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you for having me on. As I say, God ain't finished with me yet, so maybe we'll talk again down the road.
Absolutely. I will definitely look forward to that.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Be well.